at the George C. Marshall Center for European Security in Garmisch, Germany, and as the Deputy Director of the Central Asian Institute, Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. He has also worked at the Open Media Research Institute in Prague, Czech Republic, and the Department of Political Science at the University of Mississippi. Dr. Kang received his BSFS in Comparative Politics from the N.A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and his PhD in Political Science from Indiana University. He is a specialist on Central Asian security and politics with a particular interest in cross-border threats and energy security.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank the organizers for bringing me out here. Should note, and Edith and Tom know this, I was supposed to be here last year, but there was something about a volcano in Iceland that stranded me in Germany for 2 weeks, which isn't a bad way to spend time, but I was not able to make it, so I made doubly sure I could return here this year, and I'm happy to do that. Secondly, I know this is sort of a sad moment. I wasn't going to bring up the basketball issue, but since that certain school that will remain nameless also beat my Georgetown Hoyas, and since Indiana's having a dreadful year, I can at least say you guys got farther than any of my teams did. But this weekend I'm watching baseball. I have no interest in what's going on. And thirdly, I have my stopwatch with me. I have a bad habit of going over time, but please keep the cards up for timekeeping, because to speak of Central Asia, to discuss these issues is something, obviously I enjoy doing, and I think it's relevant to the issues brought up today. In listening to the first two presentations, I was already jotting notes from the frontier. The issues you raised, many of what we see in the Fergana Valley. Although with the Defense Department, I'm going to spend time without PowerPoint slides. This is sort of in the deep end of the pool. But I think I'd like to focus on this in a conceptual way. For those of you not familiar with the geography of this region, the Fergana Valley is really a relatively small section of Central Asia. It's about 300 kilometers wide, 70 kilometers, north to south. A fairly small terrain, yet within it's over 11 million people. It's a region that's owned by 3 different countries: Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and each of them, has a specific population in the region that's largely Muslim. Although, of course, there are other minority groups and other communities in there. Tajikistan section's about 2 million people. Kyrgyzstan, slightly more. Uzbekistan, quite frankly, has the lion's share of the region. So it's largely, if you look at this entity from Tashkent's perspective, back to this later, it's seen as an Uzbekistan valley with elements owned by Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. From Dushanbe and Bishkek, of course, it's seen as a shared entity. This is going to be the source of some of the issues. The region itself, of course, has had a fairly long, storied political history, and since this discussion is on the historic influences, I'd like to focus or spend some time on that. In particular, how these borders were created and how this identity within the region was created. I think this is critical when we look at security challenges today. And I say this because, of course, last year we had episodes of violence in Rush and Kyrgyzstan, and upwards of last month, cross-border problems, shootings, communal questions of border delimitation and ownership of resources. These are issues that are being addressed today in 2011. And of course, that these are issues that have gone on through the region for decades, in fact, we could say for over a century, with the current questions. But it's in this context, when we look at how this was created, as a political scientist, for me, history means simply going back to the beginning of the 20th century. We sort of take a deep breath and say, okay, that's far enough. Of course, we can go back to earlier periods, the Kokand Khanate or the Bukharan Emirate, who had at times various sort of possessions in the Fergana Valley, but I'd like to focus on this Soviet period in many ways, comparing it to what we heard in the first presentation. representation, a region that was taken over during the Civil War, and a region that was delimited in 1924, 1925. We really see this process. I would go as far back as 1918, 1936, where we see the Fermanagh Valley created in its current manifestation, current form. The normal story, the normal view from outside, is that, of course, these were decisions made in London. These were decisions made from above. And we're going to somehow divide these states, divide and conquer. We're going to create this valley that will be tri-owned, and this will force Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, or then the Uzbek Socialist Republic, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, to somehow either work together or fight off each other, balance them out, to create, or rather, I should say, to prevent the creation of a unified identity in the region. That's part of it. That's part of it. But you also had regional attitudes. You had the Jews. Well, first, when the capital was moved to Tashkent, you had also from Frunze, and you also had from Dushanbe, the views that we need to somehow expand our own territory. Particularly, we think in terms of 1929 division of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Later, in 1936, Kyrgyzstan is going to be created as a separate union republic. Each of them, of course, is going to need certain parts of their community to really create a whole state. Fermanagh Valley is a rich agricultural territory. Population base is going to be a wonderful anchor to help each of these entities, and of course it does. So the national capitals, or the republic capitals, are in competition for what. But thirdly, we have to say that the local capitals play a part. Increasingly, we're seeing research. Local communities in the Fermanagh Valley had a voice. It wasn't just from above, but it was also from below. Some communities saw economic necessity in their decisions. That is, we have strong economic links in this direction, therefore we want to go we want to be part of Uzbekistan. We see economic links going in another direction, therefore we want to be part of what eventually is going to become Kyrgyzstan. But these decisions take into account on occasion, are part of the process, and you really see a multi-layered view of how we're going to create this Fermanagh Valley as far as political geography, as far as setting boundaries. Even have these anomalies of exclaves. 8 in all. Parts of one republic wholly located in another republic. Largely based on rural communities or sort of agriculture, we would later call colossus. Uzbek, 4 of them, Uzbek communities inside Pakistan. These were deemed separate, politically part of Uzbekistan, part of the Uzbek political process, the educational process, but geographically obviously located in Kyrgyzstan. Of course, the great thing here is it's a country. These exclaves, the sort of gerrymandered that we see in Central Asia, were less of a problem because broader legal context was a Soviet legal context. We didn't have state difficulties in the region. We see the same thing across the Caspian with Azerbaijan and Armenia. I know we'll get to that later today. Now, having said that, of course, there was opposition. And there was opposition not just to the creation of the sort of multi-part states, but also, frankly, the presence of the Soviet Union itself. And we're back to 1918, the Kokand autonomy, which didn't last very long. The longer, phrase counterinsurgency groups in the region, you heard the pejorative phrase Basachi, but groups fought against the Soviet presence. Again, in at least much of the history, this was a unified whole. Obviously, historians who worked on this more closely look at the multi-level nature of the Basachi, or multi-level nature of the opposition. Some of these were religious groups. They saw the Soviet Union as an atheist state, as an outside state. We're going to fight against them. Some were remnants of the Empire of Karnataka. Some were locally who opposed Soviet control of their particular geographic entities in the Fermanagh Valley. And lastly, criminal organizations, transnational groups that worked in the region that really had no loyalties. various groups, one by one, with the last version actually going as late as 1936. So we see kind of a long history of this struggle for creating this region, this Fair Valley that we see today. Lastly, I should say, we have from above this desire to create the specific sub-regional identities that we know. And of course, with this, I'm actually focusing on the ethnic identities. You know, think in terms of Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Tajik, as if this was the natural state of affairs. And there's a great debate that goes on about what these identities created during the Soviet period, or at least reinforced in the Soviet period, taking away from other identifiers, whether they be religious or local or communal. You have political writers, Sadruddin political actors, before in Uzbekistan, emphasize this national character, this national quality of their specific people, regardless of what language they speak. Spoke Tajik, but with Uzbek nationalists. These individuals wanted to create a sense of identity that went beyond the Bulgarian identity, that went beyond the Kokand identity, went beyond Muslim identity, to create a national identity. And so to do this, of course, the Fergana Valley is going to be an interesting petri dish of creating identities. We have the cross-border views already, and each segment is going to have their own. Of course, we even have the create cultural monikers and languages or orthography, etc. in the region, which is a process that goes on throughout the period. In short, what we have through the 20th century is the creation of a divided Fergana Valley, the creation of a Fergana Valley that somehow sees itself in different parts of other entities. The Uzbek parts of the Fergana Valley look to Kent. The Tajik portion of the Fergana Valley looks south to Dushanbe, the region of which is going to Bishkek. With variation, of course, there are going to be some cross-border synergies. This is what our current states inherited. I'll just offer a few comments on the situation, sort of the so why is it important to look at this. When we look at the security context, when we look in terms of say harmonious relations in the Fergana Valley, we do have to take these historic factors into account. At the time of independence, 1991, on the Fergana Valley, usually the tinderbox has been the phrase that usually it's a source of conflict, a source of extremism. We're looking for that one true problem that's going to create. There are, again, it's rare we've already seen, looking back at the previous century. When the states independent, one of the big challenges is how do we address this Fergana Valley? How do we actually deal with these cross-border issues, which again had never been a problem. The early days were a problem crossing the border. So then we have and these are some of the things I think we have to look at. From Tajikistan's perspective, of course, their portion of the Fergana Valley as a source of support. The Spoke region today is now called is a significant part of its economy. Was frankly a source of stability during the Civil War, 1992 to 97. The Fergana Valley is actually one of the parts of Tajikistan. You travel in. There were incursions at that point, but paled in comparison to what you saw farther south. When you look from Kyrgyzstan's perspective, again, it's a source of economic development. In the Austrian Jalala region, etc. Very important for our economy. It's also seen now it's a little different. Kyrgyzstan now, of course, crossing the mountains southward into Austria, towards the southern region, is now a cause for concern in the capital, and a cause for concern nationwide. And of course, the crisis we look just at this past year, but we can also go to 1990 when we also had episodes of violence, or should I say, violence. Just as in the past, sources have varied. What we saw last summer, the number of organizations have written reports phrases that cleansing come up, ethnic violence, genocide is used. Perhaps is it political? Certain actors who felt support to stabilize the region, or more importantly, to undercut the base of an opponent. Were there criminal organizations involved? Without question. We see different levels of violence in Kyrgyzstan, and different challenges there that really tie into some of these issues we've seen. From Uzbekistan's point of view, I think the biggest challenge, because as I said earlier, they're the majority country in our valley. They're the primary state, and in many ways, from Tashkent's point of view, the Fergana Valley, their valley. They have other states. You sort of saw this early on with, after independence, it was actually from the Uzbek side that we started to see border controls. When Kyrgyzstan introduces its currency, when they started legal zone, Kyrgyzstan was the first state to do this. Uzbekistan immediately closed the border. When the IMU began incursions into Uzbekistan in 1999, the reaction was to close the border. During the 2005 Tulip Revolution, Uzbekistan closed the border. A couple months later, when they closed the border. We had last year, kind of picture, they closed the border again. They opened slightly, allowed some refugees, and make for great public relations, but again, it was a heavily monitored border and controlled border. From Uzbekistan's point of view, quite frankly, the region is not as one trade, commerce, and cooperation, but one that needs to be controlled. And so it's in this light, when we look at how are they currently viewing this region, I would argue in order to do that, quite frankly, they need to go back and look at some of the past interpretations of the border. In some ways, it's 2011, we're looking at problems that existed 90 years ago, and one could actually go further back. In the sense that we have multiple levels of groups of threats in the region, but also opportunities for cooperation. Now, I say some skepticism, because in the past, at least, as a political entity, or not at least entities that will discuss or work with each other, we're from that. There have been efforts at regional cooperation, both economic, political, and security, amongst the states, and all have failed. And current organizations such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which work in the region, quite frankly, have shared limitations, particularly with respect to the Fergana Valley. And sort of with this note of pessimism that I'm going to end, and I would say is as the current leaders look to solve problems in the Fergana Valley, and we see, of course, opportunities for cooperation. It's still an economic center. It still has great potential for trade, commerce, and yet, because there are common security threats and challenges, the Fergana Valley is one of the leading areas for drug trafficking and other trafficking in Central Asia. We see a lot of reasons to cooperate, but because of the created difference, because really of the sense of ownership in the valley, of some countries, or at least the fears or concerns across the board, we're seeing these challenges unanswered. What I'd like to do, and I guess we'll talk about in Q&A, and we can discuss this later, I know, at lunch when we discuss security issues, is to see what solutions they come up with. But I'm going to leave it at that. I think my time's about up. Thank you so much.
On keeping perfectly in mind, so that means we have a long time, I think it goes until 10:30, if I'm not mistaken. So we have quite a nice time to have a conversation. 10:15. Okay, 10:15. All right. Well, still, that's a good long time. That's 35 minutes to have a conversation about these papers, which even though they are kind of diverse in terms of time and space, there's a really nice coherence in the way in which they're all treating borderlands and considering the So I'd like to open up the floor to whoever wants to ask questions. I'm going to not talk anymore, and we'll move this on.
This is mostly to Mr. Foreign tri-state area. First you have the border regions in nationalism of which is guarded and between states that are suspicious of each other. Then you would have this non-state guardrunners, drugs, criminal gangs, what have you. And then you mentioned you have this soybean corporate farming or beginning. But actually the peasantry out. Now, from the point of view of regional consciousness, does it mean again that is not regional consciousness developing? Because obviously the age of drugs and guns and criminal elements which have come from far back, there is no such thing perhaps except that they employ local runners. At the time when three national states are suspicious of each other in a faraway border, and there is no regional consciousness. So does it again, there is in the area of soybean corporate farming, again, largely the population largely left out, no such thing, regional deputy developing?
Yeah, I think that's a question. I think if you, well, it's like capitals going ahead of peoples when you think of this regional consciousness. Because, or at some level it's articulated. When you think about the commercial sectors living in the frontier, kind of have this regional consciousness. You can see when they complain about being misrepresented to the international public. But when you think about the peasantry, and I think that's probably more like a Paraguayan, and you know, my presentation was telling a Paraguayan perspective, which is by itself incomplete take of what I'm trying to do. But I guess for Paraguayan country, they kind of cling to this idea of national identity. And when you think about across the border, the MSP, the Movimiento the Brazilian peasant movements, they are kind of reaching out and starting to create this consciousness. Probably at some point they're going to have to come together. But this, I guess, it's kind of recent when you think of it, because like they moved to the eastern region, they can't really create their own consciousness yet. They are still like being Paraguayan rather than Easterners, or being triple frontera regioners, which at some point probably is going to pick up. I don't know if I address your question.
Just a question, not a question, but the Changa on the picture that you showed. All the horses were white like parade horses ahead of the guns. Now, this picture war horse or thing.
I'm asking what the horses were white. Well, the picture was taken during a parade before dispatching the special task units to different areas of insurgency. So it was taken in Moscow. Well, maybe the horses were not of the same coloring, but look exactly like that. It was very effective, low-tech equipment that they used against the insurgents because they were very fast. And it was difficult to chase them, so it was great to fight the insurgents. There was no gas stations in Siberia, so at the time especially.
Yeah, on the your presentation, interesting about this area, which is even still today tri-border region culturally. And I knew as of 10 years ago there was a free economic zone where there's now a border between research, do you see any direct residual security issues today that manifest themselves in that sort of border region?
Well, I would say I don't see any security issues except maybe like usual criminals that you can find everywhere. It depends, I think, the level of the danger depends on the relations between the neighboring states. Since now Russian-Chinese relations are good, it's, a really robust economic zone that helps to the both economies.
And sort of a follow-on to that, and from our second lecture, do you see a tri-border identity among the people in that area? Who now share common development? If you're saying border issues are sort of minimalized to state-to-state relations, yes, some local criminality, probably to the benefit of the locals, then is in fact a character of this area?
Well, the natives of this area, they are all Mongol-speaking people, and the borders were drawn, I would say, artificially, and they separated the people into three states. This is the situation now. We live in Russia, Mongolia, and in the Mongolia region of China. So it's very complicated situation right now because, the people of the same tribes living in Russia, they speak their language and Russian, and people who live on the Chinese side, they speak Chinese. So linguistically, it's very complicated, and also politically challenging.
But do they have an identity as a tri-border people that they among themselves would recognize and acknowledge?
Of course they do. This is genealogical chronicles, because they are traced back to at least 15 generations. So people, when they meet each other, they simply discuss who came from where, who was his father, grandfather, and so on, so they can identify each other very easily. But still, we are influenced by the cultures of the nation countries we live in, and also there are some religious differences. It's very complicated, actually. I can't explain everything in a few minutes. I would say both. Much.
Well, yeah, let me explain that. I do it for each of it. It goes. And this is what Dr. Dinas also talked about. I mean, is there in these border regions a border community identity that perhaps in some, along some lines of issues and affairs, whether it's economic or military security or whatever, trafficking, that this tri-border identity sort of trumps the nation-state identity. I mean, it emerges as the stronger identity to the benefit of the local, to some cost to their state sponsor, their state, entity. So that's my sort of Fairground Valley. I'll start here and work backward.
Okay. Just, for the Fairground Valley, I would actually say it's not necessarily a valley distinction, although within each country there is a sense of being from this valley, vice other parts. Within the valley, you still have sub-regional differences. For example, last summer, the Uzbeks who fled across the border into Uzbekistan, while, obviously treated by their Uzbek hosts, were still seen as outsiders. Still seen as the other. Yes, they're ethnic Uzbek. Yes, we speak the language. There are even familial relations. There are some towns on the border that literally, have two sides, an Uzbek side and a Kyrgyz side. But there's still a sense of differences. In fact, within even a single country, you're going to have distinct sub-identities Margolin versus Kokand versus Andijan, are seen as different within the valley. Broadly, again, from the outside, from the capitals, it's seen as a collective, but within, differences still reign supreme.
I guess in this case, it is to a certain extent. It's not an easy one, because if you think of the multicultural experience that they were, with which they grow up lately, when you think about the Paraguayan case, it's kind of a tiny migration towards the late 19th century. The real migration only started in the 1960s or 1970s. You have like 500,000 people of Brazilian background. You also have the people, the Asians and Chinese. You have the Lebanese coming to make some business in the tri-state region. So you have to a certain level, as I was saying, this sort of commercial elite, they definitely are aware that they should help each other, try to, or that they rely on, they depend on themselves rather than what is going on in the capital city. Which, when you think about the Paraguayan case, Asunción is the capital, which is 220 miles away, it's very far away from them. So you can see that their development, as kind of following up on this point, they are also creating this identity within the country, which in this case wasn't really there yet before this boom. And you also see that on the Brazilian side, the Argentinian side, you also have, Brazilians speak Portuguese, Paraguayan, Argentinians speak Spanish, and also speak Guarani. So you have this sort of linguistic problem. Like the Brazilians, they will go for this, I was, going back to my introduction, go along with the movie. Argentinian Paraguayans, they don't like the movie. So they had to work it out. They are doing it. And even at the local level, they are really going ahead on that. Mayors from was across the border, and Celeste and Norte was, which is the Argentinians, working together already. So you have that sort of point.
Well, I think that people in the region I was presenting at this conference will often downplay their activities that don't benefit from them. And it's very difficult to determine a person's identity. You can't rely on either physical appearance or the language they speak. Like, I may tell you an example of the situation that I faced like 2 years ago when I visited my home. I have a real estate there in the apartment that I rent. And the time agency that I work with, I asked them not to send me Chinese people because they know my legal events and I was going to be for a short period of time there, so I couldn't check them properly if they have visa and all the to live on the Russian territory. And they sent me a guy we were talking about the rules and regulations. I wanted him to follow. Look absolutely Slavic, all blonde, blue eyes, and he spoke Russian language, so it was a kind of dialect that educated Russians speak, but I wasn't suspicious. So, and then I asked him to write down some numbers where to pay for gas and electricity, and he started to write down Chinese characters, and I was so shocked. I asked, "Who are you?" He told me, my ancestors were Russian in Manchuria, and we speak Russian home. I asked him if he was a Russian citizen. He got a told no, I have to be to determine people in regions. And usually it depends on the situation. When people have a multiple identities, they can downplay them and benefit from the situation. My opinion, it's very hard to draw a scheme so much to assure.
And I'm just making my comment. In that area, I had an experience once also talking with border forces on all of the right there. And what they told me was, if you came from that region, you were sort of a tri-border person. And they had the opposite approach as you did. In other words, if you wanted to rent an apartment there, and you were a Chinese passport holder, you were renting in the Russian territory, for instance, but you were from the tri-border area as they conceived and defined it, you would in fact be the go-ahead, not check with.
Well, since I was going back to the United States, I couldn't.
Yeah, it's not a critique on your behavior as a landlady. In fact, no doubt. I'm just saying that my question comes from experience where I had expected that to happen, just as you reacted, but was told by private officials who probably had reason to tell me the opposite. In fact, that wasn't in many cases the case to include someone before didn't have all the right papers, but was able to identify himself in that area. Like, well, yes, you're one of us. And that was the genesis of my question. There was a tri-border. It's this idea of tri-border relation, identity, self-identities that allow them to decide their state requirements or even interstate requirements because they look at themselves in a special manner. So that was my question. It is interesting.
I feel like there was a question back here. Yeah.
I heard the term hydropolitics in the introduction. Could each of you comment on what role hydropolitics has influenced the regions you were discussing?
Moving in that direction. You have none, but you also have the Ukrainian, which is like the largest, I guess, issue. It's not all in that region. It goes, basin over underneath the region I was talking about. But probably it's going, and I'm sure it's a security issue too, and it's been addressed in the Brazilian government, Paraguayan government. It's like a very widespread view that the U.S. is going to intervene to take water away from them. My interest in this case is only when I talk about hydropolitics is about dam and how the region and how the whole politics of the region goes around what's fair about the dam because it's co-owned, but you have an asymmetric relationship when you have a big one like Brazil and a tiny one like Paraguay. So, for Paraguay, they kind of have this sense that they are being ripped off because they can consume all the energy that they are the 50% that should be theirs. Therefore, they have to sell it back to Brazil, and that's their region. And basically what they're saying is that the country is kind of subsidizing Brazil. And probably it's that very politicized view. You probably have to go deeper into that, but it will be my take. I'm sure there is something to do with the Guarani acquiring large reserve of water.
For this region, Paragon Valley, you're looking at the Zaran River, and cooperation on water use has been an issue now for 40 years of independence. Prior, it was seen as a unified Soviet system, so tensions weren't significant, and in fact, programs to develop or monitor it often came from the down states. Now, in the period of independence, the upper that are trying to develop hydropower and use this as an export source of revenue, revenue, much to the dismay of the downstream, in this case, Uzbekistan. You see a north-south. The bigger tensions, though, on hydropower actually go outside this become a source of serious political tension in the region, and unable to develop, solve it bilaterally and with organizations, international groups like the World Bank, UN, try to come in and address this with, let's say, little success.
I have a little.
Yeah.
So how can Paraguayans see themselves as subsidizing when they're selling power?
Because they say that they are underpriced. Yeah, so
Why don't they just raise the price?
because well, they had this big agreement, and well, it's been debated by a long time now. Apparently, the argument goes that what Paraguay are getting is like 10%, 20%, or the price, and the electric price, which is the company, is getting a large of the energy when they sell it back in Sao Paulo. So that's the assumption. And also they say, and that was I argue that was, I would think that was what came brought to the new government of Paraguay, Fernando Lugo, with this statement, power statement against it. He said, well, we need to renegotiate this treaty, which was, signed by two dictators in the 1960s, 70s, 73. And so far, well, we couldn't see it yet. But I guess the argument would be, well, can we sell it to some other country like Argentina, which is always under power, or Uruguay, and what to deal with that, because it's a huge economic investment, really, the electricity around, and even Paraguay doesn't have the structure to really exploit that energy, which would be another.
Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Yang. We're looking at the historical perspective, but if we use our thesis that ideas don't have borders, if you look at the Fergana Valley, look at what's happening in East Northern Africa, you've got this democracy, while at the same time have radical Islam growing. Looking at the country from Tashkent to Dushanbe, what do you say the greater threat is? What do they perceive the greater threat, the radical Islam or this movement towards democracy? What do those folks look at?
Actually, I mean, from the capital's perspective, the public statement is going to always be the question on extremist groups, etc. We can obviously hypothesize that we're in a room where we're not present and they discuss of democratization. I would actually add a third one, and particularly germane to the Fergana Valley, many of these transit areas where we see trafficking and other issues. That's a threat to them that they should recognize. Of course, are the trans-border criminal groups, different organizations that, quite frankly, would love to see anarchy prevail. What we saw in southern Kyrgyzstan, their portion of the Fergana Valley, was beneficial for restructuring the criminal gang organizations in the region. I mean, some were victorious and others were wiped out. Happens valley-wide, and so I would see that as a big as a threat for the region itself of the Fergana Valley. Having said that, it's sort of interesting that during the Andijan events, however we want to describe these, whether it was a government crackdown of peaceful demonstrators, as nationals would say, or whether it was the just suppression of extremists, as the government would claim. I was in Tashkent at the time, and quite frankly, most of my friends and colleagues who had nothing to do with the government were so thankful it was happening in the valley, because that was miles away. It was a nice mountain range between Tashkent and the valley. They just were happy that wasn't going to stop them. It was sort of those people. The violence there, and that sense even within a country of another, a different part is critical here. But again, water instability, I think, as a third factor, is what I would do most here. Good question.
you know, sort of different relationship with each country, because China has a relationship with Argentina and Brazil. You can see them already over there, but not Paraguay, because it's probably coming from some sort of Taiwanese money. So they love Taiwanese money, and they are still giving to their Taiwanese friends so far. But I don't know how long it's going to last. And when you think about the business in the region, it's all Chinese already, because all this traveling back in the 1980s, where, you know, at points like was traveling Miami and going as, you know, as a commercial point in the world, and at the time he was a Chinese product. So
in all three countries, China is a critical economic actor, no question, and increasingly a political, you could say, security actor. Within the Fergana Valley, interestingly, less so, as since Chinese presence in Kyrgyzstan is lower in the north, in Uzbekistan, more in Tashkent, and I would say increasingly in westward, where you're going to have resource development. In Tajikistan, here you have one interesting inroad, and I'll use that word because it's the road from the south to the north into the Fergana Valley, which will really unite this northern region, or the Fergana Valley portion of Tajikistan, with the rest of the country. Now, Iran has already, Tajikistan, built a series of tunnels. These have been engineering disasters. It wouldn't run through one of those if you believe me, even in American dollars. And the Chinese are now building a parallel series of tunnels, and I would be more than happy to say I've seen the project is going to be a better one, because I see it as their minds, a way to integrate some of their trade routes regionally, so the commercial can travel faster. I mean, there's a positive for China to do this. But they're now playing a bigger role, and because of that, in this the Tajik government is supportive of Chinese presence. Population, different story, because of course the workers in this project, there aren't any Tajiks, they're Chinese workers. And that is the cause of some frustration.
There are many businessmen and in the area where I'm from. However, I don't see this as a tragedy, because usually they feel the niches, economic niches, the Russian system can. And I don't know, for me, it's a normal, natural process, and though the border is not open completely, but it's very easy for Russian citizens to go to China and vice versa. And there are also many Russian students in China, especially from the not only borderland regions, say Siberia and Russian Far East, who study at Chinese universities, and also we have many Chinese students going to Russia. Many Russians from the borderland territories to big for weekends, for shopping, for having fun in China. And it's very easy. Like me, 4 years ago, I paid some totally like $10 maybe, and I got permission to travel to China for months, going wherever I wanted. So it's very easy now. And, I think borderland people in both countries benefit from this situation.
We might have time for one more question, or we gravitate to the food. Coffee. Nice. Okay. Yeah. Right. Couldn't see your hand, Melissa.
Border regions are often rife with conversation, and that's a generalization, but as I look at your what's the role for legitimateness and legitimate in region? As language might divide and might reinforce boundaries, will legitimate business, big business, multinational business,
Well, I think that's a perfect question because kind of you have no answer for that one because as you can see, it's stabilizing and it's also destabilizing at the same time. It's kind of an academic answer. You have the big business creating these growing communities. You know, if you go to the eastern region of Iowa, it's like going to the cornfields in the U.S. They're all very modern. It's a whole different experience, and that definitely creates a different feeling for talking about identities. But at the same time, you have this peasantry being displaced and going increasingly violent and taking the people who is, the Brasileños, the people who is benefiting from these companies because big business are the people who, like the Monsanto or these companies that are buying their production. And so I guess you have both, and you probably if you create something that really have some multiplying effect in creating jobs, probably all will be happy. I don't see how formal legal business would be a problem. But the problem is also that it's a frontier, and by definition, it's an illegal region. So I don't see how they're going to really change as points. Like probably they're going to have to get used to
just quick sort of see this on. I'll give you two examples: one level and one level in the sense of legal cooperation. And again, historically, this is an area where trade has been ties across even these exclaves that exist have traditionally worked with, brought their products to market in other areas in the other countries or then other republics prior to independence. Back in the 1990s, the Korean company Daewoo was building. They had a plan of creating an automotive plant network in the Ferganah Valley. Actually, the specific purpose of the plants in all three countries. Very interesting. Korean businessmen said, "Hey, here's an opportunity to take this economic region. We developed sequentially, and they built their first plant outside, actually, of Anshan, part of the assembly plant. They were going to have secondary plants in other regions. Unfortunately, this really comes to fruition in 1997, 1998, and what happens in 1998? I mean, the sort of Asian economic meltdown. Who barely survives as a company. They focused on their domestic market, and quite frankly, they didn't really revisit the issue. Still, obviously, there's an automotive plant in the region, but it's a limited process. But it was interesting, had it developed, I think you were suggesting wouldn't have happened. It would have been, I think, for some serious and profitable cross-border trade. Now, at the micro level, of course, this happens all the time. There's a small town, Karasu, which has an inspection and expertise. 1993, bridges shut down. 1999, bridges shut down. Early part of this decade, the bridges actually demolished, tear it down. Now, this is a town just, sort of like Kansas City, another, exists on both sides of a border. What do? The locals actually rebuild the bridge by hand. Now, it's a bridge, and I've crossed it, and it's not, it was a little unstable, but to get products from one part to the other was necessary. You needed to keep this community going. And what has happened nationally between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, and Economies and all that good stuff, you see the area of Karasu efforts to continue cross-border trade in spite of their capitals say. So, and it's legitimate. We're not talking about, the combat issues and other groups assume have to share this, but we're talking about legitimate barriers. And so, both international companies on a broad macro level, but also level, efforts to develop this. One last comment: some groups, and this is an issue in Eurasia, which Eurasian economic community, they've talked about addressing the issue of customs and border controls. It's all tough right now. I mean, they're at the rhetorical level. I think be their downfall if they decide to look at all these things. Develop everything now, too much to do. If they do things in small steps, whether it's energy trade, water trade, or commercial trade across borders, then I think we can see traction. I'm not so optimistic on that. Maybe there's a solution.
There is an article written by Michel Foucault. The English title is "To Define and Punish." It's about the state's attempts to impose discursive illegality on the natural activities of its citizens. So there are, of course, official trade treaties signed between Russia and China, and they are on, I don't know, technologies, arm trading, whatever, big quantities of goods. But people in this area are accustomed to what I would name free trade. And they, of course, they want to avoid paying custom tariffs. So I think there is